What if Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's dramatic royal exit was not an escape plan at all, but rather a negotiation that catastrophically backfired? When Megxit first happened, I thought it was a bluff. And I've put forth this theory a couple of times on my channel, and today we are going to analyze it deeper. We are going to investigate the timeline, public statements, and the hidden PR infrastructure that proves this very specific theory, that Megxit was a bluff by Harry and Meghan to try to force the half-in, half-out arrangement that they were seeking. And the Queen called it. Hi everybody, I'm Beebs Kelly. Welcome back to another video. Thank you for joining me today. Before we dive in, I would like to invite you to subscribe if you have not yet already, and click like and hype on this video if you wish. So the main reason why I think that this was a bluff and a sort of negotiation tactic that spiraled out of Harry and Meghan's control has a lot to do with their initial statement that they made when they announced Megxit. Some of the questionable behavior leading up to it felt like it was kind of building to something, or like the Sussexes had an agenda, a secret agenda going on behind the scenes. And then it was further sort of backed up by the events that followed Megxit and the way Harry and Meghan behaved up until and just after the Oprah interview. But even looking all the way up until present day, there are signs that point to or support this theory. So today's video, we are going to be looking at the history of the entire Megxit saga through the lens of this theory, evidence that does support the theory. So let's begin by going all the way back to 2019, the end of 2019, from the South Africa "nobody's asked me if I'm okay" thing through to Megxit first. So suspiciously, in late 2019, Harry and Meghan quietly registered Sussex Royal as a trademark globally for hundreds of items, things like clothing, educational materials, campaign initiatives. This shows clear intent to aggressively monetize their titles while remaining working royals, because they did this before there was any talk of them leaving, according to everybody. And so if we look at that season where they did the South Africa tour and Meghan did her "pity me, nobody's asked if I'm okay" thing, the infrastructure for a standalone, commercialized royal brand was already being built in plain view. And this likely would have been something that the palace was saying, oh no, stop right there. You cannot be doing that. Why are you trademarking this? We need to put a stop to that, which in theory, Meghan and Harry would have begun getting combative and defensive over. With that context in mind, it's difficult to see the January 2020 announcement of Megxit from any way other than a deployment of a PR apparatus that they had spent the previous months quietly assembling. It wasn't a sudden breaking point. It wasn't a brash tantrum out of nowhere. It was the next step of their plan, and they had the chutzpah to think that they could just negotiate and force the hand of the monarchy, of the Queen, to allow it, as long as they just went forth and did it. But to get their half-in, half-out model that they were seeking, you need three things separate from the crown. You need your own foundation, your own PR team, and your own direct line to the media. And Harry and Meghan had systematically set this up before announcing Megxit. In June, way back 6 months before any of this started, Harry and Meghan officially split from the Royal Foundation, which was the joint charity that they shared with Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales. This was one of the first major structural severing of ties from the palace's centralized operational hub, which laid the groundwork for the creation of Sussex Royal. In August or September of 2019, in a massive break from royal tradition, the couple hired Sunshine Sachs, a New York-based crisis management and PR firm known for representing Hollywood celebrities. A palace source told Daily Mail at the time that hiring a Hollywood firm to represent you for PR while a member of the royal family is unorthodox, to say the least. This signaled that they were bypassing the palace's communications team, headed by Sarah Latham, to control their own US-focused narrative. Super suspicious. The next month, in October of 2019, while they were on a taxpayer-funded official tour of South Africa, not only did Meghan do the I'm not okay thing, and they did an interview, a televised interview with Tom Bradby, but they launched a lawsuit against the Mail on Sunday. And more significantly, Harry published a highly emotional, unvetted statement on their website accusing British tabloids of a ruthless campaign against the Meg. This bypassed not only the Queen and Prince Charles entirely, but their whole entire system and teams, which effectively shunned the long-standing royal PR strategy of never complain, never explain, and undermined the trip as a whole. So by October, we have the trademarking happening, issuing of statements without approval. We have the undermining of the South Africa tour, which they were representing Queen Elizabeth at the time, and the ITV documentary that they did with Tom Bradby, Harry and Meghan, An African Journey, was focused almost completely on their personal grievances and them as individuals, instead of using that as an opportunity to highlight the Crown's diplomatic work and the things that they did in South Africa. Instead, they turned that interview and special into their own personal interviews that they then complained directly to the public, which was not the plan and not what would have been approved by the palace, because that trip was a diplomatic trip representing Queen Elizabeth. So at that point, surely behind the scenes, the palace was communicating displeasure with Harry and Meghan's behavior. And in late 2019, while they were still acting as working royals, they also commissioned a Toronto-based digital agency called Article to build SussexRoyal.com. The domain was registered way back in March 2019 and was built completely outside the purview of palace aides. It went live the exact moment that they dropped their January 8, 2020 Instagram statement. But the fact that they had already started building it before they even split from Harry and William, what we see here is almost all of 2019, while Meghan was pregnant and through the birth of Archie, not only were they being super weird to the press and making Archie's birth super strange and combative for no good reason, but they were doing all kinds of things behind the scenes. They were creating a separate website, completely independent of the palace. They separated from the Royal Foundation with Catherine and William, so they had more control and could set up their own household with their own staff. They basically hijacked the South Africa tour. They established a independent PR narrative on that tour and used that tour to launch it rather than do the work that they were sent there to do, which was to, represent the Queen and highlight the diplomatic work in South Africa. They filed a lawsuit, made statements without clearing it. They hired their own PR team. They did all of these things throughout that year to sort of gear up for this. A lot of people, myself included, suspected that their 6-week sabbatical in Canada at the end of 2019 was actually a forced break after the October disasters and the South Africa disappointment, that it was sort of a consequence of how they had flown off the rails and were not staying within the guidelines of the palace, which is a requirement for the job that they had. They were working as representative of the monarchy and of Queen Elizabeth II. So if they were doing things without her permission or her knowledge or outside her view and control, then they were in a sort of breach of duty. And because they didn't like the lack of control and being reprimanded for the way they had conducted things, and because Meghan especially had never appreciated the way the press reported on her or the way the public received her, they had developed a very clear strategy that they were launching a rogue PR strike on January 8th, that announcement, what we're going to get to next, and it was backed by a fully functioning independent digital footprint by having their own website of Sussex Royal, And they had their own American crisis managers with Sunshine Sachs. And they thought clearly that this was a unilateral show of force and independence that would compel the palace to give them the autonomy that they wanted. That they could say, see, we have our own website, we have our own PR, we're doing our own thing, and we're doing a good job. See, it's fine. And they thought that they were leveraging their own star power against the palace to try to get their way. When their sabbatical over the holidays ended in Canada, Harry and Meghan came back to the UK and met with the Canadian embassy, which a lot of people think was not sanctioned. Like they didn't have permission to do that. Nobody in the Palace Network knew about that. And then they released this statement, and this was January 8th, 2020. And it was a very brash statement, and they did so without coordinating with the palace at all. On Instagram, they announced their intent to step back as senior members, balance their time between the UK and North America, work to become financially independent, while continuing to fully support Her Majesty the Queen. This was the bluff. This was it. It wasn't a resignation. It wasn't them saying, we're stepping down. What it was saying was a public declaration of a new arrangement and a new contract that they thought they were just going to force on the Queen, which just sounds insane when you put it that way. But they wanted the same status with more freedom, basically. They released this statement abruptly to try to force the palace's hand. Like, well, if it's already out there, it's out there. Are you going to embarrass yourself and everybody else by arguing that? Buckingham Palace did not take the bait. They released a terse response stating that discussions are still at an early stage, basically belittling the Sussexes and their grandiose declaration of this new arrangement that they were going to have. On January 13, 2020, the Sandringham Summit took place. Queen Elizabeth II firmly rejected the half-in, half-out model. The couple is told clearly that they cannot represent the monarch while pursuing commercial deals. And by February 21, 2020, after the palace banned them from using the Sussex royal brand commercially, the couple released a sharp, legally toned statement on their website, noting that the monarchy does not hold jurisdiction over the word royal globally, but they will comply. This marked the first public realization that their bluff failed. They lost their intended brand name and the negotiation in one fell swoop. But let's look a little closer at the events of January 8 before we move forward to the Sandringham Summit. If we look at the exact wording and the months that followed this statement, this theory of Megxit being a bluff gives a very logical explanation for a lot of the events that otherwise seemed chaotic during that time. So when they released their shock statement on Instagram, it was phrased, like I said, not as a resignation, but as a dictation of new terms. They laid out a half-in, half-out model in this statement that gave them all the benefits of royalty without any of the institutional oversight and a lack of responsibility or dedication to duties. Stepping back as senior members, but continuing to fully support Her Majesty the Queen. We can interpret that as they wanted to cherry pick high-profile royal appearances and tours without having to do the day-to-day mundane duties of standard royals with a lot of talking to plebs. Wanting to work to become financially independent sounds like they still planned on being financially dependent for some time, that they would eventually become financially independent. But it basically breaks down to they wanted to be able to sign commercial deals like with Netflix and Spotify, or sell access interviews, behind the scenes footage, things of that nature, while still acting as representatives of the crown. They explicitly stated their intent to continue living at Frogmore Cottage, which had just been renovated with taxpayer money, and assumed that their taxpayer-funded, internationally deployed Metropolitan Police security would remain intact by their, we're going to balance our time between the UK and US. They also announced that they were dropping out of the Royal Rota, which is a traditional pool of UK royal correspondence, in favor of inviting hand-picked journalists to their events, which is controlling the press. That's never going to fly if you're working as a senior royal for the monarchy, because that's a public duty sort of situation. You cannot cherry pick and control the press when you are working on behalf of the monarch. People have a right to know, and the press has a right to be there, regardless if you like them or not. By releasing this publicly before it had been agreed upon or cleared with the palace, the Sussexes clearly believed the sheer popularity of their brand would force the Queen to accept the terms rather than lose them. They miscalculated the institution's primary directive. The survival of the monarchy relies on absolute neutrality, which cannot be maintained if its representatives are making private commercial deals, and furthermore, they overestimated their popularity. They overestimated by a lot the power that they had within the monarchy too. So they grossly overestimated their personal popularity, probably in part because, when Meghan was introduced to us and they got married in 2018, she wasn't introduced publicly, really very much before 2018. She did go to Christmas at Sandringham in 2017, and we saw her, a handful of times in late 2017, but mostly in 2018. And there was the wedding, and there was all sorts of interest in her because she was brand new to, the world. Nobody knew who she was before that. And for any firsts for somebody joining the royal family, there's going to be a lot more interest, and people are going to be excited. The problem is that as people got to know Meghan and as the public got to get a better picture of who she was and how she behaved, people didn't like her that much. And so 2019 was when, really late 2018 through 2019 was when the press started to reflect that public opinion was souring on her. But I think that it's easy to see how Harry and Meghan may have misinterpreted the interest of someone new and a royal wedding being an exciting thing for people and spectators and media, misconstrued that as interest in them personally. And we know Meghan and Harry struggled to understand that people were only ever interested in them because of them being royals. And by leaving the royal format, people's interest naturally decreased really rather dramatically. And so they really should have listened to Prince Philip, who famously told everybody that it's not about you, it's about the job or the work or the monarchy as a whole. It's about the Queen. It's never about you. And the minute you start thinking it's about you as a person, then you're screwing up. Basically, you're going down the wrong path. And Harry and Meghan didn't get that. And so while I can understand that they may have had that, misconception that the interest was about them and was sustainable when it was neither, I still find it just incredibly audacious that they thought they could just sort of force the hand that we want half in, half out, and we're going to do it whether you have approved it or not. We're going to do it, and we're going to announce it, and we're going to move forward with it. And that puts the monarchy, or, in any situation, that's strong-arming a situation. It's like, we're going to basically force it to be very uncomfortable for you. If you decide to say no, you're going to have to stand up and do it forcefully and sort of take it from us, rather than working with someone proactively first and establishing something first behind the scenes in a mutually respectable way. It's very, very odd the way they approached this. It ended up making Meghan and Harry look petulant and presumptive, extremely entitled. And it also, the entire thing came off as very, very disrespectful to the Queen. And the Queen, as I've said before, was so beloved and respected and had been monarch for so long at that point and was so fully supported by her wider family. I mean, back before Megxit happened, the balconies were full of family members who came to be there, have a show of support and unity for the Queen. Every single Jubilee, every single Trooping the Color every year. These events showed that in her personal life, she had support as well as the public support. And she had very high approval ratings too, the Queen did. So it felt very disrespectful the way Harry and Meghan handled it, which then immediately made them unlikable from that moment on to so many people who had previously been neutral to them or even liked Harry and Meghan. People were taken aback by the way they handled it because even just the plain disrespect was something that a lot of people just couldn't get past. But 5 days later at the Sandringham Summit, Queen Elizabeth firmly rejected that half-in, half-out model. According to some sources, Harry was offered 5 options ranging from no change to complete separation. I'm not sure that was really the case, that there was 5 options in a range, a scale, because that just doesn't really make sense. Because really, either they comply fully with the duties of the role, and that means no commercial deals, no going rogue, no making things about you, or not, and you will be fully separate, hard Megxit. If there were other options presented, I'm sure it was things like you could be more similar to like Princesses Eugenie and Beatrice, where you still come to events every now and again, but you still need to have a low profile. You can't be making things about you. You're not going to be, doing royal work or tours or things like that. Or perhaps, something with a lighter workload, something a little bit more private, or stay in the UK and don't do royal work if you don't want, Maybe there were some options like that, but I doubt there was an actual range of different degrees of independence or control against duties and doing the job. I just don't see that as super likely, because I think when a lot of people see that, they think that it was a range of levels of 20% independent, 80% not, through to 50-50. No, I just don't think that that's what that means. But they were forced into a hard Megxit because they would not agree on the terms of, if you want to continue as working royals, this bullshit you've been doing in the last few months has got to stop. And the palace instituted a 12-month review period, which officially began March 31st, 2020. And through the lens of the Bluff theory, the 12-month window is a very crucial time. It was intended by the palace as a grace period in case the couple found civilian life too difficult or missed royal life. But for Harry and Meghan, it was perceived as a 12-month negotiating window. During this time, they retained their Sussex royal titles, although they were banned from using them commercially, and Harry kept his honorary military titles in a frozen state. They spent this year moving into California and signing their mega deals and waiting. This theory suggests that they believed as they became global Hollywood titans, the palace would look outdated and dull by comparison, which would eventually force the royals to invite them back under their originally desired terms to inject star power back into the firm. They thought if they just showed the palace that they could be in demand and could be successful and could be have media impact, that they would be asked back. Because they thought that they were the most popular people in the royal team. But by early 2021, the 12-month review period was ending, and the palace had not begged them to come back because obviously they had been hard on staff, not being team players, not working well with everyone else in the institution, and the institution was carrying on just fine without them, moving on seamlessly. On February 19, 2021, Buckingham Palace released a definitive statement. The Queen confirmed that in stepping away from the work of the royal family, it is not possible to continue with the responsibilities and duties that come with a life of public service. And I found that to be incredibly gracious and generous to them. It basically said that they've stepped away and it's not possible for them to have a continued role here, but are much loved members of the family, remember? And Harry and Meghan were snotty little brats about it. They released a petulant statement on their website. "We can all live a life of service. Service is universal," which was so illuminating. it was their reaction, a very public reaction, of them realizing that their bluff had completely failed. Harry's remaining honorary military titles and both of their royal patronages were stripped at that point and returned to the crown, and the door to the half-in, half-out model was locked permanently and has not been unlocked since. Because they were denied a royal return on their terms, they were not asked back, they were not being treated as assets to the monarchy, they were being given exactly what they asked for, to step away. They sought to prove their unmatched global value through their eyes and show the institution what it lost, from their opinion, during this time from 2020 to 2021 by signing those big deals with Netflix and Spotify. We all know how that worked out. And in December 2022, they did the Harry and Meghan Netflix fakehumentary. That was something that they had began filming much, much earlier. And then there was Spare as well after that. So between Oprah and Spare and Netflix and just the general approach of things and the interviews and the tone of Harry and Meghan to everything, it was clear that they were in this season that was peak prove them wrong phase. They saturated the market with their narrative, expected universal public reverence that would ultimately make the royal family look foolish for letting them go, and also force their hand, especially via Oprah. When we really look at Oprah closely, which we're going to do next, it's clear they were trying to force the royal family back to the negotiating table when we look at it through this theory. Because they clearly had beef with the press from the start, from even before their engagement was official, they were beefing with the press, which was foolish. And then they wanted all this control and they kept wanting to do things differently, and all of it was problematic. Behind the scenes, surely the staff, the advisors, and the Queen were sending the message that Harry and Meghan needed to stop deferring from the status quo, what was expected of them. And I've always thought it was particularly bizarre that Meghan was so new to a job that she thought it was okay to try to change things at a new job, basically. She did not treat it like a new job. She treated it like something that she could make her own. And I believe she could have, had she waited. I believe if she had spent like maybe, 5 years through, her having children and stuff at least before trying to change things, not only would the public have had more grace for her and felt like they knew her better, as she would have built trust behind the scenes, and she would have had a better understanding of how the role works and why certain rules or standards are in place, and she would have had a better footing, and then she could have made it more her own eventually. But she clearly didn't want to wait for that. But once they were initially not given what they wanted and were sort of belittled in the press and put in their place gently, and then that 1 year passed and they had these deals coming at them that they really wanted to take, and the palace was holding firm, they sort of came into this mindset, I am of the opinion, that they thought if the palace won't negotiate with us out of a desire to have us back, then we can force them to negotiate out of fear for their reputation, out of the damage we can cause to the monarchy and the individuals in it. Just weeks after being permanently stripped of their patronages, the couple sat down with Oprah Winfrey. The interview aired March 7, 2021, but was recorded mid-February, right around the time that their grace period ended and the decision became final. When they did the Oprah interview, they did acknowledge the loss of the military titles, I believe. And so clearly the decision was finalized before they filmed Oprah. Through this lens of the bluff theory, this interview was not merely them speaking their truth, which we know was mostly lies. It was a calculated, punitive escalation designed to inflict massive reputational damage on the institution that had just rejected their terms, both as punishment, but also as an attempt to force the monarchy to say, hold on, we don't want this PR storm. We don't want people to think that things are not, appropriate here. We'll negotiate with you if this just stops, and we can correct the record here and show people that everything is fine. That's the angle that they were playing at, according to this theory. And they had 3 distinct angles that they tried to use. The security lever was one of them. Harry explicitly detailed how his taxpayer-funded security was cut off unexpectedly. He claimed in the first quarter of 2020, though later facts showed he did continue to have security support, at least through the halfway mark of 2020. He positioned the palace, though, as recklessly endangering his family. The goal was to shame the institution into reinstating their elite police protection. They also tried the racism angle. They dropped the bombshell allegations that an unnamed senior royal had concerns and conversations about how dark Archie's skin might be, which was the ultimate reputational threat to the Commonwealth leading monarchy. Third, they tried the mental health lever. Meghan detailed ideations and claimed the HR department of the palace refused to help her because she wasn't a paid employee of the institution. The strategy was straightforward: create a global PR crisis so severe that the palace would have to open back-channel negotiations and offer concessions like returning security, apologizing publicly, or reinstating a half-in, half-out status just to stop the bleeding. Instead, the Queen released a 61-word statement concluding that some recollections may vary. The palace absorbed the blow, refused to engage in a public back and forth, and once again, the Sussexes were left outside the institution with no leverage left to pull. I still think a lot of their motivations for trying to force this half-in, half-out approach and going to such extreme lengths to get their way, by doing the Oprah thing, which was a big manipulation tactic to try to force people back to the negotiating table and beg them back. And just the irrational idea that they would be begged back is crazy in and of itself. But I've always thought a lot of it had to do with the jealousy that they had for William and Catherine, that they wanted to be on more equal footing with them, and Meghan's desire for attention, like interviews and things of that nature. She wanted to have a photographer where she could post glamorous behind the scenes footage of things all the time, and she wanted to be able to take interviews willy-nilly. She wanted to do an interview with Oprah before the wedding. She wanted to arrange an interview with Oprah. And these are things that the monarchy just doesn't do, because they try to purposefully avoid making it about themselves. They intentionally try to not fall into a celebrity category. And a lot of people don't realize celebrity in the UK or in Europe is a very, very different sort of industry or sort of dynamic than it is in the United States. And so there was maybe an element of culture clash that Meghan didn't really fully realize the difference in celebrity culture in the UK. But still, regardless, the job that she accepted when she married Harry was to represent the monarchy, and they purposefully try to avoid coming across as celebrities. So they don't do hardly any interviews about themselves at all. When William joins a radio talk show or something like that, he very much tries to steer the conversation towards his causes. He does not try to steer the conversation towards himself. And we have seen, Meghan, for example, is completely incapable of that. So it just feels like it was very much against the way she envisioned things to be. And so I think that played a big role in motivating them for this, but I also think their jealousy of Catherine and William and desire to be seen as more equal to them was another big sticking point behind the scenes that they tried to press forward. And they staged Megxit and brashly released those statements, thinking that the royal family would just be willing to negotiate with them and their desires, incorrectly overvaluing their presence and their role within the monarchy and their dynamic in the institution. And when the royal family they were not willing to negotiate. They were not asking them back at any point, and they were not willing to return to the table to negotiate with them by force either. Harry and Meghan then were in a position to have to ask to return. They thought that they would be missed by the public as well, I think. I think they thought that the public would be like, where's Harry and Meghan? We miss Harry and Meghan. Bring Harry and Meghan back. And when that didn't happen, they started doubling down with Oprah and then Netflix and Spare following, thinking that if not for desire, then for damage control. And when none of that worked, they thought that they could take all these media deals and pretend to be royals and prove the public and the media and the royal family wrong. And that after Netflix and Spare and interviews and projects and As Ever and all these things and faux royal tours, that they would be loved by the public and the media, that they would be revered and they would be making millions, and that they would then they would be seen as an undeniable asset to the monarchy. And then they would be asked back. And when none of that worked, we see what we saw this year of trying to sort of retreat. They've stopped the royal attacks. They've stopped doing some of their veiled nonsense in the media and some of the media games, although not fully, because Meghan still posted things and Harry posted things on the same day as Trooping the Color. Why? No freaking reason. Super silly and petty and immature. But they started doing these trips, trying to make them look more like royal tours, which circles back to that original bluff. Harry and Meghan never did Megxit because they wanted privacy. They never did Megxit because they wanted out of the controlling institution. They never did it because they didn't want to be royals. They did it because they wanted equal status, more attention, more control, and they wanted to be able to capitalize on it for personal gain and monetize it. And they still think that they're showing the monarchy what they're missing every time they do Invictus or charities or travel. And they're genuinely surprised that the royal family still aren't groveling or willing to give the Sussexes whatever they want if only they'd return. They're still befuddled by this, I think. I'm convinced that Harry and Meghan just are shocked that every time they do something that they're not getting a phone call please, would you just consider returning? We'll give you whatever you want. But now we are in phase 4 of this Megxit bluff process, which is the reality check that they have gotten. As their commercial deals failed, they pivoted away from attacking the institution, at least some degree, and they have adopted what looks like simulating a full royal half in, half out sort of status that they did not get. Clearly still waiting for an acknowledgement of their value. The June 2023 Spotify fallout was particularly harsh. Although it was mutually terminated, an executive publicly dubbed the couple grifters. The strategy of relying solely on grievance content began to show severe diminishing returns. From spring 2024 through 2026, we saw several highly publicized, privately funded international tours or trips that were in many ways indistinguishable from a royal tour format. I like to call them publicized vacations because that is what they actually are in reality, but the media still falls for the trap of packaging them as if they are tours or faux royal tours. But regardless, by executing these and persistently fighting the UK government in court to regain Metropolitan Police security details, they are maintaining a holding pattern. They are acting like working royals on a global stage, attempting to project equal status to the Prince and Princess of Wales, while waiting for the institution to finally concede their value and offer them a return on their original 2020 terms. So looking at the timeline and how the PR strategy shifted from the Oprah interview to these recent, we can behave with the WHO sort of trips, I would like to know what you think in the comments. Do you think Harry and Meghan would still be working royals today had the palace accepted their original demands? Or do you think a total fracture was always inevitable? And do you believe that the entire Megxit thing was ultimately a bluff to try to negotiate a half in, half out on the erroneous assumption that they were that valuable and that important to the monarchy and that popular with the public? I cannot wait to read the discussion in the comments section. Thank you for joining me for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have a happy day ahead. I'll see you next time. Bye!